And we are live here on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. What's up, guys? Nick Scripp on the P2W Fantasy Podcast, heading into Week 10. We have an awesome show today, a little bit different than the show that we typically have on this specific day. But as always, before we get started, this podcast is partnered up with the Fantasy Points Media Group, which is a branch of fantasypoints.com. Go check out fantasypoints.com for everything fantasy football related you are looking for in one spot. You can use the promo code P2W22 for a discount. I'm on there every single day consuming content, looking at advanced data, and I'm in the community Discord as well. So today's topic, we're talking about trading. So trading and waiver wire moves are the only ways to address team needs in redraft leagues. There's always needs when it comes to fantasy due to injuries, bye weeks, players underperforming, changes of roles, trades throughout the NFL league, etc. So sitting back and not trying to make your team better is not playing to win. Fantasy leagues have different trade deadlines within the league settings. You should make sure you are aware of when that actually is. Timing is key when it comes to trading. If you wait too long, there may be no point for some teams to trade in redraft because they're out of contention. I released some trade target videos twice now this year. Now is the time, as we get closer to those trade deadlines, to actually have a stream on it. But let's not just hear me ramble about it on this podcast. Let's listen to some advice from some other fantasy analysts, some guys I consider friends in the industry on their specific trade targets and why, and then we'll break those down. So stick with me. It's going to be an exciting show today.
Play to win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Oh, play to win, I play to win. Yeah, play to win, I play to win.
Okay, so we're talking redraft trade targets, and it's not just going to be me breaking these guys down. I have some great clips from people in the industry and their specific targets. And again, now is the time to start making those moves. If you're doing great, if you're somewhere in the middle, if you're chasing a playoff spot, plenty of time to make that team better, and trading is a great way to do so. So let's have our first analyst and their pick for a trade target in redraft.
My name is Kyle Soppe. I'm a researcher for ESPN. I'm trading for Mark Andrews right now before he gets healthy. They go on bye this upcoming week. He's already got 4 top 3 finishes. I don't think I need to sell you on how good he is. Look at the schedule down the stretch. Weeks 14 to 17, nothing but bottom 10 defenses in YPA. And look, are you ever going to get him cheaper right now? And be honest, you need a tight end. We all need tight ends. So I'm going after Mark Andrews now, getting ahead of it, profiting come championship time.
All right, so that's Kyle Soppe from ESPN, a.k.a. Thirsty Kyle, if you know him from the show with Field Yates, Daniel Dopp, Stefania Bell. So he says Mark Andrews. I think specifically for this one, there may be a team who is desperate for a win or needs a string of wins to actually make the playoffs. So you can identify that team that might have Mark Andrews and be in a bit of a pinch right now to actually have some fantasy points. The Ravens are on a bye. There's uncertainty that Andrews is back to 100% following the bye. So there is that window for Mark Andrews to be a bye. Weeks 1 through 6, when Mark Andrews was at 100%, he was tied with Travis Kelce for 455 receiving yards for first place for tight ends. He led tight ends in targets with 57 during that span. He was second for tight ends in touchdowns with 5 and second in total fantasy points. So to send a tight end plus something to the current manager, there may be some risk here if he's not 100% when he comes back. But imagine having Mark Andrews at 100% come the fantasy playoffs on your roster. So no doubt that would be an edge. And again, you might be able to catch somebody in that window that really needs a win this week. Maybe they're uncertain if he's going to be back at 100%. They're really chasing a playoff. Now would be the time to go and actually send a trade for Mark Andrews. So I do like that one. Let's go to our next analyst and their specific trade target.
Hey, what's going on? It's your player partner, Lawrence Jackson Jr. with NBC Sports Roto World, a trade target, a guy I'm targeting, popular guy. However, he has some down games. fantasy-wise is Lamar Jackson. I'll be trying to get him before the trade deadline. Despite the recent bad fantasy games, he's still quarterback 5 in points per game on a points per game basis. He's got matchups coming up against the Panthers, Jags, Broncos, Steelers, all that. Fire that on up. Try to get you a trade through. See if you can slide it on in there and get Lamar Jackson for that fantasy home run stretch, baby.
All right, so we're going back-to-back Ravens here. We have a Ravens stack for trade targets, but my guy Lawrence, a.k.a. Lord Don't Lose on Twitter, had 2 major games opening up the season, weeks 2 and 3, Lamar Jackson. He scored back-to-back games of 40-ish fantasy points. This had people wondering if he was back to 2019 MVP Lamar for this season. Weeks 4 through 9, though, he's been a top 10 quarterback, overall during that span, but he's averaged 16.33 fantasy points. So not exactly what the expectation is for Lamar Jackson. So he, like we mentioned with Andrews, on a bye this week, which is always a good time to trade for a player because there's not a lot of focus on them and whoever their matchup is. And this guy, 82 rushing yards on the ground in week 9. It reminded us of what he can do. We know that he has that upside. It's the first time he's hit that 80-plus yard line since week 3. So for checking some boxes with Lamar Jackson, Lawrence mentioned some of the matchups coming up, which is always great to look at. But history of fantasy numbers could give your team a boost, especially come those playoff weeks with those matchups. Andrews is going to return. We covered him already. Konami code upside for Lamar Jackson, especially seeing that maybe he hasn't been up to expectations, but with the upcoming string of games, he can be right back to that. So the next one we'll have, I think I have put the name on the screen. We don't have a video, but we have the audio just as good. So let's listen in to that.
Hey guys, Nick Whalen here from Football Guys @_ Nick Whalen on Twitter. In redraft and that playoff push, that championship push, running back is a position that you want to have some support, some help, some improvement from. And the guy this year is Cordell Patterson. Patterson broke out last year, as we know. He got dinged up this year, but prior to getting injured, he had 2 games of over 120 yards rushing, and he has 5 rushing touchdowns on the year, and he's finally figuring out that system. The rest of the year, this week, tomorrow, actually, he has Carolina, who just got gouged by Joe Mixon. After that, Chicago, one of the worst run defenses in the NFL. He doesn't have a top 10 fantasy run defense the rest of the season, so I would target Cordell Patterson for that push to help you win games and championships. Hey guys, Nick Whalen here from Football Guys @_ Nick Whalen.
All right, so I like that plug about Chicago. It's funny because Nick Whalen, Nick Script, both Bears fans, but I feel like we are realistic with the matchup at times, especially with running backs. But I like this Patterson call because I feel like this is not a super obvious one and not a super sexy pick, but a lot of things make sense. So the major surprise Geno Smith has been in 2022, Patterson was in 2021 is the RB9 overall. He averaged 14.7 fantasy points per game. Dropped off a bit at the end of last season, but overall a good season. He opened up 2022 with 2 out of 3 of his games above 22 fantasy points. The snap percentage in those weeks, 65, 59, 61%. On his return, this past week, he scored 18.3 fantasy points, rushed for 2 touchdowns in week 9. Week 9, he was at around 39% of the snaps to Allgeier's 38 and Huntley's 21. 14, 11, and 7 in that order for total touches. So many have commented that, hey, this might look like a 3 running back committee, but I disagree moving forward. It was his first game back. He was the best back in that backfield, and he produced at the highest level. So with the Falcons tied at 4 and 5 with the Bucs in the NFC South, I expect the heaviest workloads to go to Patterson, who has shown to have touchdown upside and then upside in the passing game through the pass. So people sometimes have their dynasty caps on when it comes to redraft trading and would rather have younger guys that actually produce less. But I feel like this older, productive running back that is done well in this Atlanta Falcons system is a good trade target. So I do like that call from Nick Whalen. Next on the list, it's going to be a 2-part video. I want to make sure I get both of it on there, and then the original is kind of big, so Might have a bit of a cut in between, but you guys should be fine listening to this. So let's hear Dave Kluge.
Man, I don't know what I can say about Donovan Peoples-Jones that I didn't already say this offseason. This guy is a freak athlete, 6'2", 212 pounds, 40-yard dash at a 4.48, and he has a 100th percentile burst score. This guy is one of the best athletes in the NFL. And slowly, we are seeing him start to carve out a bigger and bigger role for himself. He has delaminated himself, along with Amari Cooper, as a top 2 wide receiver in Cleveland. He's running routes almost every single time they're running a 2 wide receiver set, and he is doing a lot with those opportunities. Right now, he's got a 76.9% contested catch rate, which ranks 9th best in the NFL. And if all of this isn't getting you excited enough, just remember Deshaun Watson comes back in a few weeks. We know Deshaun Watson has those pinpoint deep throws that he loves to get downfield. Think about what Will Fuller used to do with their time together in Houston. Donovan Peoples-Jones, with his size, speed, and athleticism, is going to be a perfect match for the skill set that Deshaun Watson is going to bring to the table. Right now, on an efficiency basis, if you're looking at yards per target, yards per catch, contested catch rate, things like that, there really isn't any difference between Donovan Peoples-Jones and Amari Cooper. The difference is Amari Cooper is drawing more targets on the same amount of routes run, and we can't really expect that to change too much because Amari Cooper is a master at getting open and drawing those targets. But when Deshaun Watson steps in, we could see him start to push that ADOT down the field a little bit further for Donovan Peoples-Jones, while also just fostering a more explosive offense, which should offer more plays. Now, Deshaun Watson returns in Week 13. Most fantasy football playoffs start in Week 15. That gives them 2 weeks to kick off the rust before Donovan Peoples-Jones can be the late season hammer that will take you all the way to a fantasy football championship.
All right, so that's Dave Kluge. I like that call a lot, primarily because Donovan Peoples-Jones has been a guy on my waiver wire videos for a few weeks now, which I feel like shouldn't really be a thing. 5 weeks of 11 and 12-ish fantasy points. I've been saying for, again, a few weeks now that he's a touchdown away from everybody talking about him. He's been on waivers. He's kind of stuck there. I feel like from a flex perspective, scoring like, again, 11-ish, 12-ish fantasy points isn't too bad. But if there's the potential to score now, add 6 to that, that's a really good week. At least 70 receiving yards in 4 out of 5 of his last games played. During the span of weeks 4 through 8, only 10 wide receivers in the league have total more receiving yards. Yet this guy, again, is on waivers. Operating as a wide receiver 2 in Cleveland, receiving yard upside. He's going to get Deshaun Watson in the near future. I'm in for trading him in a package deal, maybe not even focused on him because, again, I don't think all eyes are on him. But if we look at the bigger picture of things with the receiving yards he's had consistently, the role he's had on Cleveland, you need to trade now before he hits that 18 to 20 point fantasy mark. So Donovan Peoples-Jones, I like that call. He's been a guy that I have liked and a guy that I feel like is, again, a touchdown away from everybody liking and realizing that he does have some upside to him. We got the next analyst on the list here, and then I got a couple of my own, but let's see what she has to say.
What's up, guys? Crystal Score here. I'm a writer for Traction.gg, which is an esports company. I cover esports, but today I'm not talking to you about that. I am talking about redraft trade targets, and I'm looking at my guy. No, not Jimmy G. That's a joke. Also, ew. This is my brother-in-law's. No, we're looking at Mr. Sun God himself, somebody that I have been saying is my guy all season, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Look, this past weekend, he had 4 receptions for 55 yards. Not the greatest. There might be some fantasy managers out there that are thinking, you know what, I'm going to throw him up, I'm going to grab somebody else. He's the guy you should be targeting 1,000,000,000%. He gets 38% of the targets for the Lions offense. 38% target rate is huge. He's the guy that Jared Goff is looking at. He's also the guy that you should be looking at. Grab him right now. That's my guy. Play to win, right? That's what we do.
And the podcast plug at the end. Gotta love that from Crystal, from Chrissy. Great call. I said to her after she sent it in that this was one of the guys I was going to mention myself. So I'm glad that she did mention Amon-Ra St. Brown, who opened up the season great, 20.4 and 39.4 fantasy point weeks. He was hyper targeted in those games with 12 targets apiece. Dipped down in week 3, missed week 4. He kind of played week 5, bye week 6, kind of played in week 7. He's been in and out of being banged up. So it seems he was back in full the last 2 weeks, but if we just look at the fantasy scoring, which a lot of managers do, 13.9 and 9.5 fantasy point finishes, not been great, right? It's not winning you your weeks. He has been targeted, though, in those 2 games 19 times. So, again, a lot of people are looking and saying, well, he's only scoring like almost 10, 13-ish fantasy points. Like, this is not what I expected him to do, but he's being targeted a ton. So, very similar to another guy I'm going to mention in a few here, but volume is coming in. He's dealt with injuries. He's not exploding for fantasy. Production is coming, especially with a big piece of that offense gone in TJ Hawkinson. So I do like Amon-Ra St. Brown as a trade target, especially seeing that, again, a lot of boxes are being checked. The production will come. If he was chasing touchdowns or chasing big plays, that's one thing. But again, what we look for sometimes is these guys that have all the signs, just not the production, but it's going to come. So timing is key in fantasy. If we wait until he has another 20-point week, then it might be too late to get him for um, a price that you would be comfortable with, I guess. But great call there. Great call by all those analysts. People I really respect. I DM'd with them and a few other people. It's a busy time of year, so I really respect them all for taking time out of their day. But again, Mark Andrews for Kyle Stoppe. You can find him at Kyle Stoppe, ESPN. Lawrence Jackson had Lamar Jackson at Lord Don't Lose on Twitter. Nick Whalen, Cordell Patterson at _ Nick Whalen. Then we had Dave Kluge with Donovan Peoples Jones at Dave Kluge. Then we had Crystal at Crystal Score at Amon-Ra St. Brown. Great targets right there. Now I have a couple of my own before we close up this podcast. So first one I want to mention, Chris Godwin. This season, he missed 2 games, but he's had a season high of 15.5 fantasy points. He's averaged 11.8 on the year. So not great, not what you want out of Chris Godwin, but he shocked us with this early return following last year's ACL tear. I think a lot of us were factoring in him coming in like halfway through the season. I really didn't think he was going to be back until maybe after the halfway point of the season. I think I was like looking at like week 9 or something like that. But 2 things stand out when it comes to Chris Godwin. Number one, the last 6 games played, he's had 10 plus targets in 5 of them, 4 weeks straight of 10 plus targets. In only one of those 4 weeks, he's had 10. That says a lot about the volume he's getting from Tom Brady. Number 2, 0 touchdowns on the year. So with the guy getting further away from his injury, the volume coming in the way that we would like for any wide receiver, especially one attached to Tom Brady, you would think this is going to lead to production as he's healthier and touchdowns as the season moves on. So again, timing is key. Have to buy now before something changes. I do like Chris Godwin as a guy that probably had a dipped um, price tag for redraft leagues that you can really take a look at and look deeper than those fantasy point weeks. Next on the list, Dalton Schultz. I actually picked up Schultz in a keeper league off of the waiver wire. So it's been a rocky ride for him weeks 2 through 6. He either didn't play or did play and scored under 1 fantasy point. So it's been a really tough outing for a season for him if you invested in him, which I was telling people to do, but again, can't really predict injuries, right? He's been dealing with a nagging knee injury through the season, but there are positive signs he's getting healthier and back to himself. 65% and then 71% of the snaps played the last 2 weeks. So we're looking at the progressions forward across the last 2 games played. Week 6, after missing week 6, he had 5 to 7 targets. That was another progression there. 49 to 74 receiving yards across the last 2 games. So we're seeing little signs of him maybe being more healthy, being more productive, which is good. He had a season high 13.9 fantasy point week last week. Most managers who have him likely had to pivot in some way throughout the season because they didn't have him healthy, didn't have him in lineups. He wasn't being productive in the games he was. So last season, Schultz had over 100 targets, ran the 5th most routes for tight ends, had the 3rd most receptions and 6th most receiving yards with over 800 and had 8 touchdowns. So healthy Dalton Schultz has a big role on the Dallas Cowboys offense. We saw that last year. We're starting to get hints of it now. I feel like he's the top 5 to 7 fantasy tight end when healthy. So again, I'm not sure if he's 100%, 90%, or up there right now. But Dalton Schultz, I feel like, again, timing is key. Just had a 13-ish point week. Things are trending in the right direction. I think if you need a tight end and that fantasy manager was able to pivot around when he was out and has another tight end that they can be playing on a weekly basis, I'd be knocking on that door, especially seeing that if he did have a 13-ish point fantasy week this past week and then he has a similar one this week, people are going to start noticing prices are going to change. Next on the list, Tyler Lockett. Everybody loves DK. Everybody loves the Geno Smith story. We all love Ken Walker, the rookie. Show Lockett some love, though. Wide receiver 9 overall in the season, averaging 14.5 fantasy points. He's had 4 weeks above that. Top 12 in receiving yards with 598. He has 14 deep targets, which ranks in 8th for the wide receiver position. Lockett has the 6th most receptions for wide receivers. 4 touchdowns on the year. Lockett has been solid, but seems like a guy not many people are crediting or talking much about because he's like this 30-year-old veteran. Capitalize on the lack of love, Tyler Lockett. So we'll go the opposite direction, not a 30-year-old veteran, but a rookie, but George Pickens. George Pickens. Now is going to be the time to try to make a move for him before we start seeing increases in production, volume, etc. So the Steelers have not been operating to the best level, but there are some signs here in Pickens' favor. Number one, Chase Claypool, believe it or not was second in targets to Deontay Johnson on this team. He's now in my city, Chicago, which good for us, but again, it clears up some targets that were being taken in Pittsburgh. Pickens should see a bump in his weekly target ceiling because of this. We've seen the productive big plays in fantasy scoring already, though. So week 4, 16.2 fantasy points and 102 receiving yards. Week 5, 14.3 fantasy points, 83 receiving yards. Week 7, 18.10 fantasy points, and he scored his first NFL touchdown. So Pickens, big play potential and receiving yard upside. Those are 2 things you should look for in a fantasy wide receiver. 14 deep targets on the year, has him 8th for wide receivers. I think he's tied with Lockett, who we just mentioned there. Nearly a top 20 wide receiver in air yards. So he's, again, having that potential to make a big play at any rate. So 4th highest depth of targets for wide receivers, again, goes hand in hand with that air yards mark. I jump now before you see him hit 8 to 10 targets and he has another 100-yard receiving day. So again, we've seen glimpses. Now his role could take a bump. George Pickens now rather than later. Last one on the list for me, James Robinson. So Michael Carter this past week had 52% of the snaps and 13 touches. James Robinson had 40% of the snaps and 15 touches. So less snaps, less fantasy production, 15.6 to 13.3, but more touches. So that's a sign to pay attention to because, again, people might dig and look at just the fantasy points or maybe a little bit deeper and say who's on the field more and say Michael Carter. But James Robinson touched the ball more. And I thought he was banged up coming into this week as well. But I do think this continues to be a committee. But I feel like J. Rob profiles as the early down running back and goal line back in comparison to Michael Carter, who he has 15 pounds on. For some of the upcoming schedule, Robinson would face the Bears week 12, who give up the 7th most points per game to running backs. And then let's look at the fantasy playoffs, right? Week 16, if you are there, if you make it there, the Lions give up the 8th most points per game to running backs. I'm sorry, that would be week 15. Week 16, the Jaguars, who give up the 9th most points per game to running backs. And then championship week, week 17 versus Seattle, giving up the 10th most points per game to running backs. So going straight down that list, fantasy playoffs, Lions, Jaguars, and then Seattle, all teams that are top 10 in points per game given up to running backs. That is huge if you are a contender looking for maybe a flex play or the insurance policy for your running back room. So top 10 fantasy matchups for the entire fantasy playoffs. A guy that will continue to grow in his role with the Jets, who I feel like, again, might be a guy who actually touches the ball more in comparison to his running back mate. We'll see through time. But James Robinson, again, not a guy that everybody's sprinting to go and trade for, but I feel like later down the road can really pay off on your fantasy team. So, again, thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you to the analysts that gave us their trade targets. It's always great to hear some other opinions in the industry and see where people's heads are at. I think that's a big way to learn, is just looking at other people's perspectives. Maybe you buy into it, maybe you don't, but at least you can see where people are valuing things and seeing potential for ways to make your fantasy team better. If you have any trade questions when it comes to your league, feel free to add me at P2W Fantasy at any time. I answer trade questions on a daily basis. I'll have the start show at some point this week. Wanted to throw this one in there though, because again, very important trading and waivers when it comes to bettering your team, trying to make a push for the playoffs, trying to make a push to win your league. It's the play to win mantra right there. And trade deadlines are going to be coming at any point now. Make sure to check your league settings. But good luck in week 10, guys, and enjoy the night.